Laughter echoed across the valley when a desperate, debt-ridden farmer unleashed a herd of knee-high goats to save his dying 80-year-old orchard. Neighbors called him crazy. Rivals called him finished. But what those tiny animals did next didn't just silence the critics. It revolutionized an entire agricultural empire in the heart of Oregon's fertile Hood River Valley, where the shadow of Mount Hood looms over miles of pristine farmland. Elias Harding was fighting a losing war. At 68 years old, Elias was the third generation to work the soil of Harding Heritage Orchards. His grandfather had planted the first Honeycrisp and Bosque pear saplings back in 1942. Over the decades, those trees had grown into massive, sprawling giants with trunks as thick as oak barrels. They were Elias's entire life, the only remaining connection he had to his family legacy after his wife passed away 5 years prior. But now, his beloved orchard was being suffocated. It started as a small patch near the eastern irrigation ditch, but within 2 seasons, a monstrous, mutated hybrid of Himalayan blackberry and deep-rooted field bindweed had exploded across the property. The locals ominously called it Devil's Snare. The aggressive vines crawled along the soil, wrapping tightly around the bases of the heritage trees, choking off their water supply and stealing essential nutrients. Worse, the dense underbrush trapped ground moisture against the ancient bark, creating a perfect breeding ground for a deadly fungal infection known to orchardists as collar rot. Elias tried everything. He spent grueling, back-breaking weeks out in the sweltering July heat, swinging a rusted machete and pulling the thorny vines by hand until his leather work gloves were shredded and his forearms bled. But for every foot he cleared, the Devil's Snare grew back 2 feet longer. The conventional solution, pushed heavily by the local agricultural extension, was chemical defoliation. "Just nuke it, Elias," advised Dr. Holden, an agronomist from the county board. "Bring in the commercial sprayers. Douse the lower canopy in industrial-grade triclopia." But Elias knew the truth. His 80-year-old trees were fragile. Their shallow feeder roots sat just inches below the topsoil. The heavy chemical herbicides required to kill the mutated bindweed would seep into the earth and poison his heritage trees, destroying the orchard just as surely as the weeds would. It was a catch-22 that seemed to have no escape. Watching Elias's struggle with predatory glee was his neighbor, Jackson Miller. Jackson was the owner of Miller AgriCorp, a massive, sterilized farming operation that relied on GPS-guided harvesters, drone surveillance, and thousands of gallons of synthetic chemicals. Jackson despised Elias's traditional methods. To Jackson, the Harding property was nothing more than 50 acres of prime real estate standing in the way of his corporate expansion. One sweltering afternoon, Jackson pulled his immaculate, lifted Ford F-250 up to the barbed wire fence line that separated their properties. He rolled down his tinted window, sneering at Elias, who was exhausted and leaning heavily against the fender of his battered 1974 pickup truck. "You're fighting a ghost, Elias," Jackson called out, his voice dripping with condescension. "Those trees are dead walking. The rot is going to set in before the autumn harvest. Save yourself the humiliation. My offer of $800,000 still stands. Sell the land to me, take the cash, and go retire in a condo in Portland before the bank forecloses on you." Elias tightened his grip on his muddy shovel, his jaw set in a hard line. These trees survived the freezes of the 70s and the droughts of the 90s, Jackson. I'm not selling out to a man who treats the soil like a chemistry experiment." But Jackson just laughed, a cruel, echoing sound that carried over the wind. "Suit yourself, old man. I'll buy it for half that price at the foreclosure auction in December." That night, staring at a stack of past-due notices from Pacific Northwest Bank, Elias sat at his scratched kitchen table, desperately scrolling through agricultural forums on his old laptop. He was looking for a miracle. Deep in the archives of a sustainable farming database, he found a bizarre, heavily debated case study from an obscure vineyard in southern France. They had used rotational grazing of miniature livestock to eradicate invasive brush without damaging the main cash crop. Elias's eyes widened. Sheep were too clumsy and would eat the low-hanging fruit. Cows were too heavy and would compact the fragile soil over the root zones. Standard goats would stand on their hind legs and strip the bark off the trees. But what about something smaller? Something with an insatiable appetite for weeds, but too short to reach the precious apples and pears. The next morning, Elias withdrew the absolute last of his savings. He drove 3 hours south to Bend, Oregon, pulling up to High Desert Farm, a specialized livestock breeder run by a woman named Cassidy Flynn. When Elias returned to the Hood River Valley that evening, his livestock trailer was carrying 40 Nigerian dwarf goats. They were comically small, barely 20 inches tall at the shoulder, with big, expressive eyes, stubby legs, and coats of erratic brown, white, and black spots. They looked more like oversized plush toys than agricultural saviors. The lead buck, a feisty little creature Elias named Barnaby, immediately tripped over his own hooves upon exiting the trailer. By noon the next day, word had spread across the valley. Jackson Miller and a few of his farm hands stood at the fence line, howling with laughter. "Hey, Elias!" Jackson shouted, tears of mirth in his eyes. "What's the business plan here? You opening a petting zoo? Charging kids $5 to feed the livestock? You really have lost your mind." Even the locals down at the Riverbend Diner were shaking their heads. The consensus was unanimous. Elias Harding had finally cracked under the pressure. Tiny, knee-high goats against a monstrous, valley-swallowing superweed? It was the final, pathetic gasp of a dying farm. Elias ignored the taunts, gritted his teeth, and opened the gates, releasing the tiny herd into the overgrown orchard. He prayed the French case study was right. He prayed the goats would go to work. But as he watched them scatter into the towering weeds, his heart sank. For the first 2 weeks, the valley's mockery seemed entirely justified. The deployment of the Nigerian dwarf goats was by all observable metrics an unmitigated disaster. Instead of acting like the ravenous, weed-eating machines Elias had hoped for, the tiny goats treated the dying orchard like a private amusement park. Barnaby and his herd spent the first few days ignoring the suffocating bindweed almost entirely. They hopped onto overturned aluminum water troughs, chased each other through the tall grass, and took long, lazy naps in the dappled shade of the apple trees. When they did eat, they nibbled on the harmless clover near the tractor barn, completely bypassing the thick, thorny stalks of the devil's snare. Meanwhile, the crisis in the orchard was accelerating at a terrifying pace. A bizarre, unseasonal atmospheric river swept through the Pacific Northwest, dumping a week of warm, relentless rain over the Hood River Valley. The sudden influx of moisture, combined with the unseasonably warm temperatures, created a deadly greenhouse effect beneath the dense canopy of the heritage trees. The devil's snare thrived in the muggy conditions. The invasive vines surged upward, creeping past the base of the trunks and beginning to entangle the lower scaffold branches of the apple trees. The bindweed leaves formed a thick, impermeable mat over the soil, trapping the heavy moisture directly against the 80-year-old bark. Elias's worst nightmare was coming true. Walking through the eastern block of the orchard, his boots sinking into the saturated mud, he pressed his fingers against the trunk of a massive honeycrisp tree. The bark, usually firm and deeply grooved, yielded like a wet sponge. The distinct, sickly sweet smell of decay hit his nostrils. Phytophthora collar rot had begun to set in. If the base of the trees wasn't exposed to sunlight and dry air within the next 14 days, the vascular cambium of the trees would completely rot away. The trees would be girdled. The entire 40-acre block would die. Permanently. The financial walls were closing in just as fast. On a dreary Tuesday morning, a sleek black sedan pulled up the muddy driveway. Wyatt Hayes, the senior loan officer from Pacific Northwest Bank, stepped out, carefully avoiding the puddles in his expensive leather shoes. Jackson Miller was with him, hovering like a vulture, waiting for the final breath of its prey. Elias met them on the porch, his face pale and exhausted, holding a cup of black coffee in a trembling hand. "Elias," Wyatt said, his tone dripping with false sympathy. "I'm sorry to do this in person, but your farm's equity is plummeting by the day. We've had our agronomist survey the property from the road. The collar rot is evident. The crop yield for this autumn will be near zero. Your loan is severely underwater." "I just need a little more time," Elias pleaded, his voice hoarse. "The goats just need to acclimate. They'll start eating the brush." Jackson Miller snorted loudly, leaning against the porch railing. "Those oversized rats aren't doing anything, Elias. The bank is going to issue a notice of default by the end of the month. But I'm a reasonable man. I'm still willing to write you a check today. 600,000. It's less than before, sure, but the land is degraded now. It'll cost me a fortune in bulldozers to rip out these dead trees and clear the weeds. Take the deal, Elias. Save yourself the bankruptcy." Elias looked out over the orchard. He could see the tiny goats huddled under a wooden shelter, completely dwarfed by the massive, encroaching jungle of weeds. He felt utterly defeated. The legacy of his grandfather, the decades of sweat, the memory of his wife walking through the blossoms in the springtime. It was all going to end in a sterile bank transaction. "Give me until Friday," Elias whispered, staring at the floorboards. If the rot spreads to the upper canopy by Friday, I'll sign the papers." Wyatt nodded sharply. "Friday at noon, Elias. We'll be at the bank." By Thursday evening, a severe thunderstorm rolled into the valley. The sky turned a bruised, violent purple, and the wind howled through the gorge. Elias sat in his dark living room, listening to the rain batter the roof. He couldn't sleep. The thought of losing the farm was a physical weight on his chest. Around midnight, the rain broke, leaving a heavy, misty fog rolling through the trees. Unable to bear the silence of the house, Elias grabbed his heavy Maglite flashlight and stepped out into the damp, cold air. He needed to say goodbye to his trees. He trudged through the mud toward the eastern block, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the thick mist. As he approached the worst of the infestation, he heard a strange sound. It was a rhythmic, collective rustling, accompanied by the distinct snapping of thick roots and the low, synchronized chewing of dozens of jaws. Elias raised his flashlight, the powerful beam sweeping across the base of the massive apple trees. He froze, his breath catching in his throat. The goats weren't sleeping, they weren't playing. Led by Barnaby, the entire herd of 40 Nigerian dwarfs had formed a systematic, tightly packed perimeter around the base of the oldest, most suffocated trees. Something miraculous had happened. Perhaps it was the sudden drop in barometric pressure, or perhaps the heavy rains had washed away the bitter surface oils of the devil's snare, making the plant palatable. Or perhaps the weeds had entered their late summer seeding phase, pulling starches down into their lower stems, transforming them from toxic brush into a high-calorie feast for the ruminants. Whatever the biological trigger was, the tiny goats had turned into vicious, hyper-focused eating machines. Elias crept closer, shining the light directly on Barnaby. The little buck wasn't just chewing the broad leaves. Because the goats were so short, their snouts naturally hovering mere inches from the ground, they were attacking the weed exactly where it was most vulnerable. Using their incredibly dexterous, split upper lips, the goats were plunging their faces into the soft, rain-soaked topsoil. They were grabbing the thick, fibrous taproots of the bindweed and pulling backward with surprising violence, snapping the stems at the subterranean level. Elias watched in stunned silence as a female goat named Daisy aggressively stripped a massive thorny blackberry vine from the trunk of a tree, chewing up the razor-sharp thorns without flinching. Their unique, high-metabolism digestive systems were designed to handle tough, woody forage that larger animals would choke on. More importantly, because of their tiny stature, they were crawling underneath the lowest apple branches, easily navigating the tight spaces between the massive roots without compacting the soil. They were performing microscopic, surgical weed removal that no human with a machete or machine could ever replicate. Elias fell to his knees in the mud, tears mixing with the cold mist on his face. He watched the dirt fly as 40 tiny, relentless pairs of jaws ripped the suffocating blanket away from the base of his trees. Where there had been an impenetrable wall of green vines, trapping the deadly moisture, there was now a ring of exposed, muddy soil. The cold night wind was already sweeping across the damp bark of the heritage trees, drying them out, arresting the fungus in its tracks. They were doing it. The tiny mocked animals were dismantling the devil's snare root by root. But as Elias looked down the agonizingly long rows of the 40-acre property, reality set back. They had cleared perhaps half an acre in one night. It was an astonishing feat, but tomorrow was Friday. At noon, Jackson Miller and Wyatt Hayes would demand his signature to forfeit the farm, and Jackson had already arranged for a county surveyor to officially declare the orchard a biological dead zone to expedite the sale. The goats were finally fighting back, but as the sun began to peek over the jagged peaks of Mount Hood, Elias knew a terrifying truth. 40 tiny goats might not be enough to stop a multi-million-dollar corporate buyout that was already in motion. The real war wasn't just against the weeds anymore. It was against the clock. By 5:00 a.m. on Friday morning, Elias's leather work boots were completely soaked with freezing mud. His calloused hands shook violently, a combination of consuming too much black coffee and the pure, unadulterated adrenaline coursing through his aging veins. He stood silently in the mist-covered eastern block of his orchard, his flashlight beam cutting through the fog, watching Barnaby and his 39 spotted companions completely annihilate the mutated bindweed. But as miraculous as the sight was, Elias's mathematical reality was grim. 40 miniature mouths, no matter how ravenous, were physically incapable of clearing 50 sprawling acres of dense brush before the noon deadline. Elias pulled his cracked cell phone from his heavy flannel jacket pocket and frantically dialed the only person who might understand the biological miracle happening in the dirt. He called Cassidy Flynn, down at High Desert Farm in Bend. "Cassidy, they're eating the tap roots," Elias gasped into the receiver, bypassing any polite morning greeting. "They're tearing the devil's snare straight out of the topsoil. But the bank is foreclosing at noon today. I need more animals. I need every single Nigerian dwarf you have on your property." On the other end of the line, Cassidy didn't hesitate for a fraction of a second. "I have 150 yearlings, and mature does currently loaded in the sorting pens. I will load the double-decker commercial hauler right this second. But Elias, listen to me. I cannot get heavy transport equipment up through the Columbia River Gorge in less than 4 hours. You have to stall the bankers. Whatever it takes, buy me time." At exactly 11:45 a.m., Wyatt Hayes pulled his pristine black luxury sedan up the muddy gravel of the Harding farmhouse driveway. This time, Jackson Miller didn't come alone to gloat. He had strategically brought the regional county agricultural surveyor, a notoriously strict and unyielding botanist named Dr. Evelyn Rostova. Jackson had paid her department a premium fee to officially declare the property a biological dead zone. This devastating legal designation would instantly nullify Elias's grandfathered agricultural tax exemption, bypassing any standard grace periods and triggering an immediate, irreversible property foreclosure. Jackson stepped out of his lifted truck, a deeply smug, victorious grin plastered across his face. He held a sleek leather clipboard containing the transfer deed. "Time's up, old man. Sign the deed over to Miller AgriCorp right now, or Wyatt here legally seizes your tractors, your barns, and your home by 1:00 p.m. Elias stood firmly on the wooden planks of his porch. "I'm not signing a damn thing, Jackson. I am formally invoking the Hood River County Agricultural Remediation Clause, Section 4, Paragraph B, Subsection 2. Wyatt frowned, nervously adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "What exactly are you talking about, Elias?" "It means," Elias said, his voice surprisingly steady and authoritative, "that if a propertier initiates an active, ecologically verifiable remediation effort before the final notice of default is signed, the county surveyor is legally obligated by the state to physically inspect the progress before officially condemning the soil." Jackson burst into a cruel, echoing laugh that startled a crow out of a nearby pine tree. "Remediation? You mean your pathetic circus act with those petting zoo animals? Dr. Rostova, please go tell this delusional fool his beloved heritage trees are rotting from the inside out so we can finalize this purchase." Dr. Rostova pushed her glasses up her nose, her expression entirely neutral, and unclipped her digital diagnostic tablet. "Lead the way, Mr. Harding. But be warned, my metrics are strictly scientific and completely objective. If the cambium layer shows irreversible phytophthora necrosis, the bank takes the land today." Elias led the tense trio out to the eastern block. The thick mud sucked greedily at Wyatt's expensive leather shoes, while Jackson marched forward with triumphant, arrogant strides. But as they crested the slight grassy ridge overlooking the oldest grove of honey-crisp trees, Jackson's smug expression instantly vanished, replaced by a look of sheer, uncomprehending shock. A full, continuous acre of the suffocating, impenetrable devil's snare was completely gone. It hadn't just been cosmetically trimmed, it had been violently eradicated. The ground surrounding the massive 80-year-old trunks was stripped down to the bare, breathable earth. Dr. Rostova gasped audibly. She dropped to her knees, completely ignoring the wet mud staining her tailored slacks, and aggressively pressed her electronic moisture meter against the ancient bark of the nearest tree. "This is biologically astonishing," Dr. Rostova whispered, her eyes wide as she rapidly tapped the screen of her tablet. The ambient terrestrial airflow has dropped the surface moisture against the bark by over 60% in less than 12 hours. The fungal bloom is completely arrested. The vascular tissue is already hardening off. What commercial chemical did you use? Triclopyr? Glyphosate? I don't smell any synthetic residue whatsoever. No chemicals, Elias said proudly, pointing a weathered finger at Barnaby, who was currently standing on his hind legs to aggressively rip a massive, thorny blackberry root right out of the muddy earth. Just him, and 39 of his very hungry friends. Jackson's face turned a mottled, furious shade of crimson. "This is a stupid parlor trick. He cleared a single acre. There are 49 acres left suffocating in weeds. The bank is not going to halt a multi-million-dollar foreclosure because a few oversized rats ate some overgrown grass. Wyatt, process the default right now." Wyatt swallowed hard, nodding nervously. "Legally, he's right, Elias. One single acre simply isn't enough proof to save the projected autumn harvest. The financial math does not support a loan extension. I need your signature." Elias looked down at his silver wristwatch. It was 12:15 p.m. His heart plummeted violently into his stomach. He had played his absolute last legal card, and the delay just hadn't been enough. Then the ground beneath their boots began to physically tremble. A deep, rhythmic, mechanical roar echoed down the quiet valley road. Through the breaks in the towering pine trees, a massive 18-wheel gleaming silver livestock transport truck came barreling up the dirt driveway. Its heavy air horns blasted a deafening, triumphant wail that shook the farmhouse windows. The massive diesel truck ground its gears loudly and hissed to a dramatic halt right in front of the porch. The driver's side door swung open, and Cassidy Flynn jumped down to the gravel, tossing a pair of heavy leather work gloves onto the hood. She walked straight over to the stunned group in the orchard, grinning from ear to ear. "Sorry I'm late," Cassidy said, winking directly at the terrified banker. "Hit some nasty logging traffic on Highway 97. Where exactly do you want the cavalry deployed, Elias?" Jackson sputtered indignantly, pointing a shaking, furious finger at the massive silver trailer. "What the hell is that?" Cassidy confidently hit the hydraulic release button on her remote control. The massive rear steel ramp of the trailer lowered to the dirt with a heavy, echoing metallic clang. For one agonizing second, there was only silence. Then came the deafening sound of bleating. 150 Nigerian dwarf goats flooded down the steep metal ramp like a chaotic tidal wave of spotted fur, sharp hooves, and insatiable hunger. They surged past a terrified Wyatt Hayes, completely ignoring the shocked humans, and locked their sights directly on the sprawling, untouched acres of Devil's Snare. Dr. Rostova stood up slowly, wiping the dark mud from her knees, a rare, genuine smile breaking across her stern, professional face. She turned to the furious corporate farmer and the trembling loan officer. "Gentlemen," Dr. Rostova said, her voice ringing with absolute legal authority. "Based on the biological eradication rate of the initial test group, I professionally estimate this newly expanded herd will completely clear the remaining 49 acres in roughly 14 days. The fungal infection is officially halted. The property remains legally viable. There will be no foreclosure happening here today." The following 3 weeks became the stuff of legendary agricultural lore throughout the entire Pacific Northwest. The Harding orchard was miraculously transformed into a vibrant masterclass in aggressive biological remediation. The massively expanded herd of 190 Nigerian dwarf goats descended upon the Devil's Snare with terrifying, systematic efficiency. Because the invasive bindweed had entered its late summer starch-storing phase. The thick underground roots were absolutely packed with sweet sugars. The goats didn't just graze the surface leaves. They physically excavated the earth. They dug their tiny, sharp hooves deep into the soft, wet topsoil, clamped their powerful jaws around the thick taproots, and pulled backward with immense force, ripping the invasive thorny vines out by their subterranean anchors. But they didn't just remove the deadly threat. They actively healed the catastrophic soil damage. As the goats devoured thousands of pounds of invasive brush, their unique, hyper-rapid digestive systems processed the toxic weeds into highly concentrated, nitrogen-rich organic pellets. They were simultaneously aerating the compacted soil with their tiny hooves and depositing premium, chemical-free fertilizer directly over the shallow, desperate feeder roots of the ancient heritage trees. Jackson Miller was practically frothing at the mouth with unbridled rage. Desperate to illegally halt Elias's miraculous recovery, Jackson tried every dirty trick in the corporate playbook. He furiously called the local law enforcement, Sheriff Brody Mitchell, demanding that Elias be severely fined and cited for operating an unlicensed commercial livestock feedlot. Sheriff Mitchell, a pragmatic man who had happily bought Harding apples since he was a little boy, drove his cruiser out to the farm, spent an entire hour happily feeding Barnaby some leftover graham crackers from his lunchbox, and drove away laughing hysterically at Jackson's absurd complaint. Next, Jackson maliciously tried to weaponize the environmental regulatory boards, falsely claiming the goats' agricultural runoff was dangerously polluting the local valley water table. But when the state water inspector, a sharp-eyed, meticulous technician named Harrison Cole, arrived to formally test the irrigation ditches, he discovered the exact opposite phenomenon. Because Elias absolutely refused to use the toxic industrial defoliants and synthetic pesticides that Jackson constantly relied upon, the water leaving Harding heritage orchards was scientifically proven to be the cleanest, purest agricultural runoff in the entire Hood River Valley. By the time the crisp winds of September finally rolled around, the visual transformation of the property was staggering. The suffocating, deadly blanket of Devil's Snare was completely eradicated, permanently replaced by a lush, manicured, emerald green floor of native clover. The 80-year-old trees, finally able to breathe and heavily super-fertilized by the continuous goat manure, exploded with vibrant, astonishing life. When the autumn harvest officially began, it wasn't just a financial recovery. It was a record-breaking, historic triumph. The Honeycrisp and Bosque pears were massive, deeply colored, and possessed a crisp, complex, incredibly sweet sugar profile that artificial chemical fertilizers simply could never replicate. The harvested fruit was so spectacularly perfect that Harrison Cole, who privately moonlighted as a boutique broker for high-end culinary restaurants in Seattle, boldly bypassed the commercial packing houses entirely. He immediately offered Elias an exclusive, ironclad contract with a premium organic farming co-op. Elias sold his entire autumn crop at an unprecedented 300% market markup. The massive cashier's check he received on the very first day of November wasn't just enough to easily pay off his past due loan with Pacific Northwest Bank. It was enough to completely pay off the entire property mortgage forever. The sweet, poetic irony of the entire situation wasn't lost on the local farming community. While Elias's organic, goat-driven method beautifully revitalized his ancient soil, Jackson Miller's ruthless corporate empire was rapidly crumbling under its own toxic, unsustainable weight. Years of excessively heavy chemical defoliants and synthetic fertilizers had completely sterilized the essential topsoil microbiome over at Miller Agricorp. When an unexpected, brutal, dry freeze suddenly hit the valley in late November, Jackson's chemically dependent, shallow-rooted, high-density commercial trees couldn't absorb any vital subsurface nutrients. Within a single devastating week, a massive, unstoppable fungal blight rapidly swept through Jackson's sterilized, weakened orchard, completely destroying over 60% of his entire cash crop. Sitting dejectedly in the back booth of the local Riverbend diner, Wyatt Hayes, the very banker who had once viciously threatened to take Elias's beloved home, was now sweating profusely, desperately trying to restructure Jackson Miller's collapsing, catastrophic corporate debt. To avoid immediate total bankruptcy, Jackson was legally forced to sell off 200 acres of his absolute prime real estate to an organic farming trust. Elias Harding never gloated about his victory, but he did make one very specific, highly visible purchase with his newly acquired wealth. On a crisp, bright Tuesday morning in early December, Elias slowly drove down the main valley road in a brand-new, gleaming, cherry-red John Deere tractor. The enclosed cabin was warmly heated, the stereo was loudly playing classic country music, and sitting incredibly proudly in the customized passenger seat, wearing a tiny, high-visibility orange safety vest, was Barnaby the goat. As the massive tractor confidently rolled past Jackson Miller, who was standing furiously by the barbed wire fence line, miserably surveying his dying, chemical-scorched trees, Elias simply tipped his worn canvas hat, hit the heavy throttle, and drove back toward the healthiest, oldest, most resilient orchard in the Pacific Northwest. The entire valley that had once mercilessly laughed at the stubborn old man and his tiny goats was now silently, respectfully, taking notes. Did Elias's brilliant fight against corporate greed inspire you? Nature's smallest creatures often hold the most powerful solutions to our biggest problems. If you loved watching this stubborn farmer and his tiny goats defeat the odds and silence the critics, hit that like button. Don't forget to share this incredible underdog story with your friends and subscribe to our channel for more amazing real-life agricultural miracles and inspiring stories every single week. See you next time, friends. Stay wonderfully inspired.